So it's my great pleasure to introduce Tara. She is the Chief Executive Officer of Ways to Wellness, a health charity delivering at-scale social prescribing. Ways to Wellness was the first health service in the UK and globally to test social impact bond investment paired with a fully outcomes-based contract. Tara has led Ways to Wellness for 6 years since its launch early in 2015. Previously, she worked in the National Health Service, or the NHS, in commissioning roles and as an OT for 10 years in England and Canada. In her early career, she was an exploration geologist. She recently completed 2 years as a Fellow of Practice with the University of Oxford's Government Outcomes Lab. She holds several voluntary positions on boards and committees of non-profit organisations in the UK. She has an MBA from Durham University in England in 2013, and an MSc in occupational therapy from McMaster University in 2002, and a BSc in geology from the University of British Columbia from 93. In her spare time, she enjoys running, yoga, time with family and friends, being outdoors and learning new things. So Tara, it's now over to you. We are all looking forward very much to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Gina. I think the screen, there we go, it was just caught up. It's really wonderful to be here. What an honor to be invited when I got contacted by McMaster. It was really lovely to be invited to speak and to have so many of you attending today live, or at least virtually live. I'm, of course, attending from England, so it's evening here. And I'm going to start today with a brief summary of my career path to date. And then I'm going to speak to you in more detail about Ways to Wellness, which is the charity that I've been leading for 6 years. And I'm going to describe to you about social prescribing and social impact bonds. And we'll have time for questions at the end. So it's been said before that my career path was maybe a bit unique, has been, and maybe has had a few twists and turns along the way. As you know, I came to McMaster in 2000, graduated in 2002 to undertake a master's in occupational therapy. At the time I was 28, I was moving from Vancouver, where I'd lived in BC all my life at that point. And it was part of a career change coming to McMaster. So moving from exploration geologist to occupational therapist. I had grown up in BC, in fact, in a small remote First Nations community on the northwest coast, Bella Coola. And I had moved to Vancouver at 15 and had spent 13 years there. I'd done my last couple of years of high school and then done my undergraduate degree in geology and worked as a professional geologist for just over 6 years. And doing a lot of work in field camps in remote corners of the world, fly-in only camp in the Yukon, working in the semi-desert in Argentina. And I really enjoyed the challenges and the adventures that came with that. But as many of us in our 20s start to learn more about ourselves and have more experiences in the workplace, I came to have a realization that I didn't have the deep love of rocks and exploration as some of my colleagues did, the other geologists I work with. I was more interested in people and how people worked and working with people than I was with rocks. And also I'd had a particular experience. My mother had cancer and died when I was 25. And as that sort of thing often does, it makes you reevaluate your priorities and look at your life choices. And so when I started to look around at career options, health sciences was something that really seemed to marry my interest in people and how they work, as well as my love of sciences. And occupational therapy in particular, I was intrigued by because of the way it married the medical model and the social model, and particularly the holistic approach. So once I decided on OT, I was going to make it work. And I applied to every program there was across the country from coast to coast, 6 in total at the time. And the reason I chose McMaster was I was really interested in the problem-based learning approach, as well as the self-directed learning. And Mac didn't disappoint. I had a really good 2 years there. I really enjoyed living in Hamilton. And to this day, to be honest, I draw on some of the learning about myself, the self-awareness and reflection, as well as some of the sometimes painful, but really eye-opening feedback I got during problem-based learning tutorials. So one of the other benefits of being at McMaster is one of my classmates introduced me to my now husband. So when I graduated, I moved to Ottawa to be with him where he was doing his PhD. And I was a new grad in OT. And so as you do, I moved around jobs, first doing holiday cover to try and get my foot in the door, and temporary jobs, and then permanent. And I got a lot of really good experience and enjoyed all the roles, to be honest. But my two favorite were chronic pain rehab and stroke rehab. After just over 6 years in Ottawa, my husband's work took us to England. So it was 2008, and I was on my second maternity leave. So we had a young baby and we had a 2-year-old. And we relocated, and after settling in, I then applied for an OT job in the UK, so in the northeast of England, and I got a job in a stroke service there with the National Health Service, the NHS. And after a few years working there, at the time, at least in my perception, in the part of England I was in, it felt like there was a limit in terms of my career path, in terms of progression in OT. So I started to look around. I was also noticing my thirst for learning new things, and my curiosity about health management and policy and decision making at that level was starting to be piqued, and I wanted to kind of contribute at a higher level, but also learn more. It was actually, to my great surprise, that I chose to do an MBA. My husband had been talking about it, had suggested it would be a good fit for a few years, and I had been graciously declining. It didn't seem really to me to marry up very well with OT. But in the end, actually, when I thought about how I wanted to move faster and further with this next career change, I was 40. It was a different time in my life, and I didn't want to start right at the beginning of a new career path. I want to start a little further ahead and maybe move faster once I got started. It felt like the MBA was something that would get me that big step that I was looking for. And, as with when I changed from geologist to OT, career change does feel like you're jumping off a cliff and you're wondering if your parachute is going to open. And it definitely felt that way. And for a good year, I wasn't sure that parachute worked. But eventually, just before I graduated, I did find a job back in the National Health Service, this time in commissioning. There were these newly formed clinical commissioning group, which are these local bodies that decide the funding and planning around service redesign and performance, etc. So after a couple of years in NHS commissioning, someone sent me a job description around a new charity. And this is what I'm going to go into detail with you about in a few minutes, Ways to Wellness. And this is where I spent 6 years working on building a new organization, a new company, delivering social prescribing and a social impact bond. And I must say that's where I really used my MBA, starting a new company and working across all the organizational management roles that are required in that role. And I must say, before I move on, very briefly, after 6 years at Ways to Wellness, last week I started a new role as Associate Director of Newcastle System in the National Health Service, so a local commissioning group focused on leading service redesign around improving the integration of local health and social care in such a way that the system works more collaboratively and more joined up for patients. So I won't go into that in detail. I'm going to share my screen now so that I can start talking about the last 6 years at Ways to Wellness, which is what I've been invited to do today. Great. So as I said, I'm going to speak to you about Ways to Wellness. So I'm going to take you through the organization Ways to Wellness, because what I'd like to talk to you about is social prescribing, but also this kind of investment social impact bonds. And they really dovetail in Ways to Wellness, and they're kind of inextricably linked. So by taking you through how it came about, the reasons and what it does, how it's structured and what it's achieved, I hope I'll be able to, well, for those of you that don't know much about social prescribing or social impact bonds, I hope it'll bring it to life. So the first thing is the case for Ways to Wellness. Why do it? Always when you're thinking around health services or addressing health inequalities, you're thinking, what's not working at the moment? What's the unmet need? And it won't surprise anyone, because I think across the developed world, it's very similar. So the statistics will be similar in Canada. But in England, long-term conditions account for 70% of health and social care costs. And they're really going up rapidly. And not just that, the burden is being disproportionately shouldered by those who experience deprivation. So there's an 18-year health gap in healthy life expectancy between the most and the least socioeconomically deprived in England. I'm going to forget where I live. In Newcastle upon Tyne, which is where Ways to Wellness is based, in the northeast of England, there are even higher levels of deprivation than there is on average in England, and in particular, higher levels of long-term conditions. And even compared to similar levels of deprivation, the unplanned admissions to hospital are higher. So we had the National Health Service, the local planning, wanted to be able to address that. That was the need. And then we looked at the intervention approach. So we were working with other charities in the region that were experienced in social prescribing, and we started to look into the evidence base, and it's very compelling and even growing in terms of the rigor of the evidence, that supporting people to manage their long-term conditions is more effective than the conventional medical model approach on its own. And you can see here this pie chart from the New England Journal of Medicine, that healthcare is actually you can only attribute in terms of outcomes, of overall health outcomes, healthcare is behind 10% of the outcomes. And the other proportions are, individual lifestyles and social circumstances. So Ways to Wellness response to this need was to design a social prescribing service that would provide personalized and comprehensive and long-term support, and more about social prescribing on the next slide, but to be able to support people with long-term conditions to better self-manage. But then the National Health Service, the NHS, really struggles, and all health services really struggle to divert funding from hospitals and services that are required in terms of urgent care to move it up front into a more preventative care. And so this is where the social impact bond comes in. £1.65 million was committed by a private investor. In the end, we only drew down 1 million, but that funding was to deliver the service in the early years so that the outcomes could be achieved. So I'm going to get into a bit more detail on this, but we have a contractual arrangement with the NHS, the National Health Service, a 7-year contract where we're paid 100% based on outcomes we achieve. And about a third is on well-being improvements, and 2/3 are savings in hospital costs. This next slide will show you a bit more if you're struggling to get your head around that. So the slide's a bit busy, but if I show you in the middle, we've got Ways to Wellness, which is the organization that was a startup 6 years ago. It's a nonprofit, so a charity, and it has contractual relationships with all the parties. And if we start at the top and go clockwise, the National Health Service, the Newcastle Gateshead Clinical Commissioning Group, we have a contract with them to pay on outcomes. So these pre-agreed outcomes, for them, the priority was to reduce hospital costs, and that's the majority they pay. And then we have some central government funding, National Lottery and the UK Cabinet Office, to pay for well-being improvements, although the local commissioner pays a bit on that as well. And then if we go clockwise round to the social investor, Bridges Fund Management, committed to a loan agreement, and they committed that at risk. So that 1.65 million, of which we drew down 1.1 million, that was only going to be repaid to them if we achieved our outcomes. And luckily we have. And then when you achieve your outcomes in full, they get repaid with a cost of finance, so a profit goes to them. And then if we move down to the bottom, clockwise again, we've got service delivery contracts. And that's the other key partner in this. We've got charities and social enterprises delivering the service, and they employ the link workers. That's the title of the role of delivering social prescribers, and they work directly with the patients. And on the left side, clockwise, if we go to 9 o'clock, we've got GP practices. We don't have actual contracts with them, so they don't have any financial arrangement with Ways to Wellness, but they're making referrals, and they're members of the clinical commissioning group, is a membership body made up of the GP practices in the region. I'll come back a bit more to the social impact bond arrangement, but I want to now take a step back and talk to you about what social prescribing is. I'm guessing that a lot of you will not have heard of the term, in fact. And to be honest, 7 years ago was the first time I had heard of the term, and it has grown in popularity in the UK. I think in Canada, it's probably less used as a term, but it will exist. It's essentially, lots of charities are doing it. It's essentially an option for non-medical support. So patients, we all know, whether we have a long-term condition or not, that our lifestyle and areas of practical, emotional, and social areas of our life impact our health and how we feel. And social prescribing is about giving support to people for whom, well, there are barriers, or they don't have the resources or the resilience to be able to self-manage that without a little bit of extra help. So the word prescribing comes in. You can tell it's a very medical term, but it's giving medical professionals another option, another place to refer other than medications, or send a referral to another medical professional. And it also is a way to link in to sources of support in the community, because not that many GPs, nurses, other OTs, physios, other doctors and health professionals are going to know about all the nuanced options and choices and little groups and clubs and things that are available in the community. Link workers, who are the, as I say, the staff professional name for someone who delivers social prescribing typically, they know about that. That's part of their role, is to be really familiar with the local landscape of charities and groups and services that can support patients. They typically work, and certainly with Ways to Wellness, they work one-to-one with patients. They identify what the patient's priorities are and make sure that it is important to them and it's their priorities, not the medical professionals. And then they set goals with them, an action plan. And if that would benefit from signposting to any local groups, they'll do that. And they're trained in motivational interviewing, behavior change approaches, and just generally, they're usually people. They're very good with building rapport and developing relationships. You'll see in the colorful boxes around in the rainbow, some of the categories where people typically set goals. And it's where you would expect getting involved in groups, healthy eating and cooking, etc. Ways to Wellness has specific referral criteria. That's my last bullet on this slide. And that's because we are working with an outcomes-based contract. We only get paid if we reduce hospital costs. So we're working with an age group where we think they're old enough to be potentially with a long-term condition presenting at hospital, but not as old that it might be appropriate for them to present because they're end of life, or if there's a frail elderly component. And we have certain long-term conditions, and that's based on the data that we had access to for our comparison group, because we get paid relative to a matched comparison. And more on that later. This one slide, I just wanted to highlight a few of the specific characteristics of Ways to Wellness, because you will have social prescribing that's done on a smaller scale or is very specific. Sometimes you get social prescribing for people with anxiety to do artwork. And Ways to Wellness is a more broad referral, except for those eligibility criteria. We work with people who have, we work with the people that are eligible, no matter what else is going on in their life. And we're working in an eligible population of 14,000. Now, keep in mind, we're in the northeast of England, and it's not heavily populated up here. We have Newcastle's it's less than half the size of Hamilton in population, and we're only working with half of that population. So think of a quarter, less than a quarter of the size of Hamilton. And then we've got our referral criteria. So of the 14,000 that are eligible to be already have had 7,700 referred in 5 3/4 years. Although it has really slowed down with COVID, but so most of those were referred in the first 5 years, is really unheard of in a charity that's just started up to get that much traction with health services and that many referrals. So we're really proud of that. We have 22 link workers delivering the service, 18 full-time equivalent. And just some statistics about the support. On average, people set 4 to 5 goals. 60% of them are signposted to external services or organizations when it would help them with their goals. And they receive 17 contacts from their link worker each year. And they're with us on an average of 19 months. Usually the intensity of intervention is much higher in the first 6 to 12 months. And then we maintain contact to ensure that things don't slip back and to build resilience and embed behavior change. This bottom of the slide, I just have a quote to capture Newcastle University. We've been involved with a lot of academic research. It's been really a privilege to have academics looking at what we're doing for the value in terms of the objective evaluation. And some qualitative work they did, some interviews with patients, they noted just how complex and how how we're working with people who really do need the help, who experience deprivation, comorbidities, stress, anxiety, depression, economic issues, debt, housing problems, low income, etc. So my next 3 slides, I wanted to bring some of the social prescribing to life in terms of the people. So I have this woman is a case study. She's Asian British in her early 50s, and she has quite a few things working against her or presenting her with difficulties in her life. She has type 2 diabetes. She's experiencing racial abuse in the neighborhood where she lives, severe depression and anxiety, mobility issues, from a musculoskeletal condition, socially isolated and lonely. She also is a carer for her daughter who has physical disabilities, low income, and English is her second language, and her literacy was low. So the link worker initially started working on the social housing, so getting her, applying for and bidding for her to move into a new property. And when this was written, she had already been offered a new, more suitable location, so she was moving soon. This, the kind of thing a link worker is going to know is that there was a particular grant giving body, a local one, that reached out to Ways to Wellness and told me, and I passed on to the link workers, that there were grants, there was money available for purchasing appliances and furniture if there was a need, and they just needed to fill out the application form, demonstrate the need. What a difference it makes to someone who had grown up cooking really complicated meals, was a really good cook, had diabetes, and it was really important to be able to eat well, and was eating ready meals because she didn't have an oven or even a stove top. She didn't have a mattress even, and was sharing with her daughter. These are the kinds of things that can make such a difference. And then from there, you can start to talk to her, and the link worker did, around getting more support around her English literacy, getting out into the community more, using mobility aids. And she said at the end, I couldn't even think about any of this when I met you. Never mind, know how to do it. I'd forgotten who I was before I became unwell. Now I'm back to being me. And she was making less visits to her GP, less calls to the urgent and emergency care as well. This gentleman, he's white British, early 60s, so a bit older than the woman I just spoke about. And he has a complex picture as well: COPD, heart disease, regular and long-standing heavy smoker, poor diet, and he's quite socially isolated. He's retired, but he also has limited social activity, and his biggest worry was his debt. He has limited literacy skills. I think he had left school very young, and some physical activity and poor mobility as well. Now, the key thing with him, and we see this relatively frequently with clients, he refused to make lifestyle changes. And you get this where a GP or a nurse or a therapist, they know it would make a huge difference for someone to stop smoking or to eat better or to exercise. But these are the things people do to cope because they have so many stressors. And so the first thing the link worker did with this gentleman was to look at his furniture debt, consolidate that, arrange a benefits advice welfare rights meeting, and he discovered he had some benefits that he was entitled to that he didn't know about. He had all kinds of letters from an energy company around debt, and because of his literacy, he was really struggling to navigate them. So the link worker sat down with them and helped him make phone calls and respond. He now understands his condition better. He's attending appointments, and having addressed his worries about finances, he was open to reducing his cigarettes. He stopped smoking cigarettes completely, but he did swap to e-cigarettes and was reducing them. And when this case study was written, he hadn't quit those yet, but he had significantly reduced them. And his quotes, you can see at the bottom there, saying, I couldn't have done this on my own. And he knows that the link worker is at the end of the phone if he needs support. And that's why we keep people on even for a short period, 6 months after their active goals are set, because we know that there often is this sense of needing to build resilience around not having setbacks. This is a gentleman who is a little less complicated, or at least when he tells his story, but he's really lovely. Let me play this video. I'm hoping it'll work.
When you are retired like me, loneliness is the killer, if I could say that. You wake up in the morning, you have nowhere to go. Okay, you have a cup of tea, listen to the news, go to the internet. Then by 10 o'clock, you are virtually done, finished every day. So the link worker did help a lot in introducing me to other people to talk to them, people of my age mate, and to do other activities. There's a role there in terms of social integration within the community. I think the link worker was important, was very, very important there. Yes, medically, we go to the doctor, but everything is not necessarily solved by doctors. You see, the social aspect of it has to be looked at differently. And in my case, I think the social aspect really did help me a lot. That, what the Waste Wellness did was that they referred us for cooking. So I learned how to cook for myself and also how to do other dishes, which Waste Wellness helped. And we also went to bowling club. This was good. This was very good. We're in a fairly big group. We're in a bowling club, and we practiced how to do the bowling effectively. As far as I'm concerned, that time was that loneliness. You know, when I retired, I had nothing to do. I had so much time to myself that at the end of it, knowing that I was going to go to Waste Wellness at least once a week, it covered my day, my loneliness.
So that was Jack. He always puts a smile on my face. He's lovely. I love his quote, "Loneliness is the killer." I also always think of a long-suffering wife when he says he finally learned how to cook. The link worker taught him to cook and to do the dishes. So link workers have many skills, broad and far-reaching. Then these next two slides, I'm going to talk a bit about what we've measured and the impact and the outcomes. So I mentioned earlier that Waste to Wellness is paid 100% on outcomes. It's a contract that, you know, our staff costs will only be covered, including the link workers and my costs and everyone's, if we achieve these pre-agreed outcomes, about 1/3 on improvements in wellbeing and 2/3 on reductions in hospital costs. So the first impact is what I mentioned earlier. We've had 7,700 people referred and 5,600 engaged on the program. So that's a really, well, we'll only make an impact if we get people in the door and we engage them. But then, of course, it's about what we do with them. So we use the Wellbeing Star to measure impact in terms of wellbeing improvements. And this is a validated tool. It may not be, it wasn't one I had heard when I worked in Canada. It's been developed in the UK by Triangle Consulting. And you can see it has 8 domains that broadly will capture the breadth of well-being generally. It's developed for people with long-term conditions and patients self-rate on a scale of 1 to 5. So here I've included all the patients that we've been able to measure change with. So we measure well-being every 6 months. So of course we measure at baseline when they first come in the service, and then we have to have the patients stay at least 6 months to capture some improvement. And over 4,200 patients have been on the service long enough for us to have measured this. It's not going to mean much to you that they've improved 3.4 points or 12% if you're not familiar with the assessment. But I think you can see from the bar chart that the domain of lifestyle is where people self-rate as being the lowest. And not surprisingly, they set the most goals to make improvements in that area. By a long shot, about 50% of the goals are set in that one domain of the 8 domains. And gratefully, they're seeing improvements, almost double the average improvement across all the domains, so 22% improvement in lifestyle. And this is something that marries up really well with the theory of change and the logic model of social prescribing and waste to wellness. We know, under lifestyle is eating and exercise, even sleeping and stress, a lot of things that are really important to managing long-term conditions like diabetes and heart disease, etc. Now, my last slide around impact measurement is a wee bit busy, and I'm just going to take a breath here. And this is a graph that shows 6 years of measuring hospital cost reductions, and it's a little bit tricky to understand. I've been explaining this for a long time, and even some people on my board of directors struggle a little bit with the concepts. I've got a baseline year in here, and then we have the second year is when we first opened the doors and started to ramp up. we always actually modeled it. So our payments for this particular outcome, secondary cost reductions, hospital cost reductions, would start in year 3. And the social impact bond was required to pay for a lot of the costs of service. I mean, it was blended with some of the well-being payments in the early years, but by year 3 was when we started to really get our outcome payments to cover the cost of service. And that's gratefully when we also saw the costs really start to pull apart. So the waste to wellness cohort is the blue, and it's not increasing nearly as quickly as the control cohort. So it's not technically a control for people who are statisticians or medical researchers. It's a counterfactual. We've got a matched cohort, and we're matching the cohort at cohort level. So when you see, for instance, last year, as the last full year we have is 1920, which is year 5, waste to wellness was 9% less per head costs in the comparison, but that's the whole cohort. So this is where it's really a little bit tricky to get, but we can't rematch every time someone comes through the door. So we take the full cohort costs, and that way we can have some faith that the characteristics of each cohort are the same and well matched. And so that's diluted because we're working with less than half the cohort. I mean, a small fraction in the early years, and even still quite a bit less than half, closer to a third. So if we then reverse the dilution to account for the fact that we're only working with a small proportion of the people we're measuring, there's a difference is actually 27%. So the savings and cost per head between the waste wellness cohort and the counterfactual comparison cohort is 27%. So that equates to a cost difference, a cost savings of £1.56 million last year in 2019-20, and a cumulative cost savings across the first 5 years of 4.6 million, which is, once you take the cost of the service delivery and the cost of finance, the social impact bond returns, it's 1 million net. That's what's retained in the NHS. So I just have 2 slides left now. And what I'd like to touch on is some of the learning and some of the success factors. What worked well? What did we learn from Waste to Wellness? Its model, the social impact bond, and also the outcomes contracting, which, as I said earlier, are all inextricably linked. I could spend the full hour talking about this one slide. And in fact, I just finished quite a comprehensive report on the first 6 years of learning in Waste to Wellness. That is, the final draft form is not quite ready to publish, but it will be on the Waste to Wellness website, I would have thought, within the next couple of months. If you are interested in more detail, keep an eye out. But I think I'll highlight a few things that I think are the most important, and I've kind of got them in order here. The focus on outcomes and impact, well, the clue's in the name, isn't it? Social impact bonds and outcomes contracting. I do think for those of us that work in health and in the nonprofit sector, we all have the right intentions. We all get up in the morning to make sure that we have a positive impact on people's lives. But it is really easy to drift away from what we're really there for and really trying to do and making the most about impact. And I think there's something about everyone being absolutely focused. You live or die on those payments. If the payments don't come through, then the service stops. So the focus is really strong on that. Of course, that comes with some downsides. It's a lot of pressure. But actually, with all these points, there's always another side to the coin. I would recommend that if you are working with outcomes contracting, to try and keep it as simple as possible and have the measures be something that either is easy to do in the course of delivering the service or is already being collected anyway, like our hospital costs, or metrics that are already collected. What's really key when you're working out the outcome metrics is pricing them right and getting the alignment of incentives across the partners right, including sharing risk. And when I say incentives, I don't mean, we're all intrinsically motivated. So I don't mean those incentives, I mean the financial ones. Those are tricky. And pretty much, you can do everything you can to get that perfect, or as perfect as you can when you sign the contracts, and as soon as the ink is dry, something has shifted and changed. And certainly over the 7 years we have contracts, things change all the time, even before COVID. So that sort of alignment and risk sharing is quite tricky, and it does shift and change. partnership working, I think, is one of the real benefits of a social impact bond, because what it demands is you always need an outcomes contract with the government. So you've always got public sector. It's almost always a private, well, it will be a private investor in terms of investing the social impact bond. And it's typically delivered by the nonprofit sector, so the voluntary sector. And that kind of bringing together those are the three sectors in society. And then there's those are the ones that are financially involved, and then health services and service users are involved in terms of using the service and referrals and all kinds of other feedback loops. But that partnership working can be very powerful. It can also be hugely tricky, and it requires a lot of investment and time and relationships. The key thing is for the shared values across the partnership, the partners that are contractually involved, at least, with a commitment to the double bottom line. And this, of course, is much easier said than done, but this idea that we can't put the money over the patient impact, but neither can we put the impact over the money. There has to be both for the partnership to work. And that's one of those kind of intrinsic principles of a social impact bond. There's a few other points here around where you need a lot of detail. Number 5 is around the modeling. There's a lot of detail behind a social impact bond that's helpful. It was really, I mean, I really like detail, and it was really helpful for my role to have all that, but it is sometimes it's difficult for others that are more at a distance to understand. It could reduce transparency. Point 6 is around the use of a special purpose vehicle. So that was what Ways to Wellness is called in this particular social impact bond terminology, which means that we were there just for the purpose of holding the contracts and keeping a focus on them and monitoring the data and making sure we were optimizing things. That means we're at a distance from the actual service delivery. And there's pros and cons to that, but that extra layer isn't always helpful. We had multiple providers in the delivery, which again brought benefits in terms of testing and trialing different approaches and bringing all the expertise together, but it meant more communications, more layers, and pros and cons to those sorts of things. One thing I'm really proud of is I think we made a big contribution in Ways to Wellness. This is my last point, number 9, in terms of building the understanding and the evidence of social prescribing and the link worker role and defining it and bringing evaluation. When you're doing something at scale, you just get a lot more data, and we've involved a lot of academic evaluators in understanding what we've learned. And now social prescribing has been funded by NHS England as core funding. So every GP practice in the country, as of last year, had at least one link worker, and that's building from there. So social prescribing has become mainstream, not only because of Ways to Wellness, but we've been one of the key players in demonstrating the benefits. So this is my last slide, and it's just bringing it back to the social impact bond, because for some of you, I mean, that's what's really unique about Ways to Wellness, I suppose. We were the first in health, and some of you might want to know a little bit more about that. There's, of course, more I could say, but what I already mentioned just how much it focuses everyone, all the partners, on impact and outcomes. It also demands a high level of rigor in terms of measurement, monitoring, analysis. So you need to understand what you're doing and why, and how things are changing, and then get feedback loops back into management decisions and also service delivery decisions. And that can be really beneficial if the partners involved are also keen about learning along the way and adapting. But it requires a lot of change management. The SIB and particularly the outcomes contracting element that's paired with it has quite a bit of flexibility. Now, it's in a relatively narrow way in that it will be, if you have one particular outcome, you're not being contracted to hire this many staff with these kind of credentials and to deliver this many contacts, like so many. You can increase your staff, you can deploy your staff in different ways, and you can deliver the service in different ways within that kind of narrow band of what are we trying to do, what are the outcomes we've decided, what have we agreed. And that's really helpful because you'll find that best practice and quality improvement emerges as you go along with something, particularly when it's innovative. The long-term financial viability for all stakeholders, so everyone who's part of the contracts, that needs to be built in, or the social impact bond doesn't really work. And it should be that everyone, including the government, is retaining savings and passing on some of it. The investors getting their money back and making a profit, and the service providers are getting new funding, new streams of funding that often charities and nonprofits sector really struggles to get, and is able to cover their costs and have some surplus for their charitable objectives. So it should be built in. It's not always easy. As I said, things get misaligned as you go along, but that should be something you return to as a principle. And I think, maybe I'm biased, I've only worked in the nonprofit sector for 6 years now. And as of last week, I've moved again back into the public sector. But I do think one of the benefits of the social impact bond is it draws on the expertise and the strengths of community organizations, and it also reinvests in those organizations and builds their skills and builds the sector. I think that's a really important element. Now, of course, there are always going to be downsides. The pricing of outcomes is really critical, and it needs to be carefully done and probably needs to be adapted as you go along, maybe. That's really difficult conversations. That's my next point around alignment of priorities, incentives, and risk balance. I mentioned that earlier, that it's always going to shift and change because the world changes. And no matter how many scenario plans you do, there's so many variables in complex systems, like working with people who are vulnerable. You're never going to get all of the variables quite right. And that's, if I was to summarize all these bullets in the lessons learned, essentially you're working with quite high levels of uncertainty and a lot of complexity. And that's uncomfortable for all of us. And so you need to devote time to relationships, time to working through what you're seeing in the data, understanding what that might mean in terms of adapting the service. And all that is really tricky, and especially if people are a bit uncomfortable, it can be quite hard on capacity, on morale, and it can be, trust is absolutely critical, but it can be quite hard to maintain trust when everyone's feeling a bit uncomfortable with all the uncertainties and risk. So I'm going to end there. The website link, I think, can be circulated later with the survey. If you don't get it now, there's a generic email because my email isn't active anymore as of last week, but you can find me on LinkedIn. And I think that's probably time to stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Tara, for your really interesting presentation. We're going to move over now to the questions. So we've got a number of questions that people have submitted from the chat. So we're going to take the next 15 minutes or so just to discuss them with you, Tara. So the first question is, how did you find the courage to make a career change, and what drove this desire?
So where did I get the courage to make the career change? There's an expression my father always uses: necessity is the mother of invention. I think sometimes you just get to the point in life where you realize the fit isn't right. It isn't right with your lifestyle, or it isn't right with your financial situation. And for me, it was a leap of faith. As I said, it does feel like jumping off the cliff when you make a career change, and you might have all the plans in the world and a parachute on your back that symbolizes that. But if it doesn't open, it just feels really difficult. But I think there's intrinsic motivators and there's extrinsic ones. And I think I'm always motivated to learn new things and strive. And if I feel like I've learned more, I want to contribute at a higher level, because I think you can make a bigger difference the more expertise you have, if you're leveraging that and building on it. So that was my intrinsic motivation. But some of the extrinsic motivators were things like moving to a new country and finding that the system worked differently in the UK. The government funds, for instance, funds the OT programs, so the tuition is paid for and cost of living is often paid for. And so when you graduate, it's a different calculation in terms of salaries and career progression. It's quite a different model. And having funded myself to go back to school at a master's level, I was looking for a different match. So I guess I just had to dig deep and find the courage.
Wow. Well, that's an amazing story. So kind of linked to that question about careers is one of the comments was that it's been a very interesting career path that you described at the beginning. Did you find that each step actually contributed to where you are now, or was each a total kind of fresh and clean break and a completely new venture?
I think when I changed in my late 20s from geology to occupational therapy, I remember using the expression, I've cashed in all my chips and walked away from the table, and now I'm going to do something different. It felt like a more of a clean break, but of course, life experience and work experience is something you always carry with you. There's no question that since then, every step I've taken has had a little bit more of a connection and a bit more of a master plan, I think. And even now when I'm taking, I find, you'll have options about which jobs to take. And I often take risks to think I'll take a job that maybe no one else wants. Maybe it's temporary, maybe it doesn't have much job security. Maybe, other people might not want it for various reasons. And then I end up taking it because I can see that there's a stepping stone, or I can see that I'll be able to move higher faster because I'm willing to do that and make a bigger step with my career progression.
Great. So also linked a bit to the career choice. How did you make your decisions or choices about which jobs actually to take at which points in your career in order to ultimately become as successful as you have become?
Oh gosh, that's quite linked to what I've just said, but you can never really know what the future is going to bring. And I think I would be overstating it. I would be giving myself too much credit if I said that I knew that each job would lead to the next thing. So some of it is about just having faith that if you choose something that you think is interesting, and if you think the learning will be rich, and it will be complementary, and you'll be able to really draw on your strengths and be able to grow in ways that you think are aligned with where your strengths are. I think that's really how I've made my decisions. And as I said, taking calculated risks can make a big difference. So moving into a role that someone else might not be willing to do, if you think about what the reasons are, it may mean that you're competitive for a role you never would have been if it had been permanent or had a really good pension, or, you have to understand what it is that makes other people apply for the jobs in a job market, and then position yourself to be as competitive as possible.
Okay, so a little bit linked to that, but just taking a step backwards, really. How did you find that your experience and life in Canada, including education at McMaster, prepared you or enabled you for your career and life in the UK? And what advice would you give to any future McMaster alumni?
Oh gosh. I think Canadians, it's a gross generalization, isn't it? But living in the shadow of the US, I think we have a sense of modesty and curiosity that I think serves all of us really well when we move to a new country. And I think, when I was at McMaster, I remember the learning around thinking lifelong learning is exactly what we all need to do to survive. And what is life if not a series of problem-based learning as well? And I think that I have to say that there is a lot I draw on in terms of the way I think and the way I approach problem solving and life choices and life decisions based on how I learned to think at McMaster. I think it does set you up well. Will you thrive in England because of it? Well, I think you thrive almost anywhere if you have that openness to learning, and you and a curiosity, and you're willing to consider other people's perspectives and see things from different angles. And being an immigrant, that's self-awareness, and to be able to understand how other people might perceive you is critical. It's almost an anthropological study when you're an immigrant. if you want to move into roles where it's really important to understand how people think and how people communicate, you pick up a lot of, you have to learn expressions, you have to learn turns of phrase that are very, in my case, I think a lot of them are even regional rather than British. They're things, they're Geordie, which is the northeast of England where I work. And that's, yeah, I think Canadians are good at watching other people.
So is there anything particularly a word of advice that you might give to our alumni?
Well, yeah, the lifelong learning element, just expect to never stop learning, graduating and developing a love for learning. So yes, we learn in the ivory towers of academia, but when you graduate, if you're always embrace learning and realize that anytime you get a setback or a struggle or a challenge, it's an opportunity to learn. And I think that will serve you quite well in life.
Well, that's great. So there's one last question, and it's a completely different. It's taking it back to the social impact bond. And I think that's kind of nice to end the questions, really. So the question is, what was the biggest hurdle or challenge you had to overcome as the first health service in the world to use a social impact bond investment? And I know you sort of alluded to it in the presentation, but maybe you could throw some more light on it.
Well, I think when you're the first in anything and you're breaking new ground, there is this enthusiasm that people get when they're innovating. I mean, I think maybe now it's not so much the flavor of the day. Now, at least in England, it's more about collaboration. But it used to be that if you said you were innovative, then you got all the funding, you got all the kudos, and everyone gets really enthusiastic about trying new things. But it is so exhausting when even you think you've done most of the work getting across the line to get it launched and started, but it is just a continual process of breaking new ground without any blueprint. So you don't have a roadmap when you're innovating. You don't have anyone to call to say, you've done this before, how did it work for you? What are the pitfalls? What are the how can I learn from you? You're having to write the map. And I think that I was surprised just how naive I was, and a lot of us were, and how exhausting it was on relationships and demanding it was. And when you've got that many, when you're innovating on several different levels in different ways, and you've got that many variables, how uncomfortable it is for people to keep coming back to, oh, we haven't got this figured out. Oh, I'm sure last month we had it figured out. Remember that really big breakthrough we had? Now we're there. And you have to keep coming back and keep iterating. And how hard that is, on your own energy levels and morale, but on relationships and trust. I would think I was naive about how much you have to invest in the partnership working in that regard.
Well, Tara, I have to say we've come to the end of our questions and our question time now, but I wanted to thank you for having provided us with a wonderful presentation, lots to think about with social impact bonds, as well as some really interesting considerations about career changes and how those are made. It's been a pleasure to listen to you. So thank you very much indeed for presenting for us this afternoon.